My name is Fiona Croft. I'm 36, and I've stitched up shattered skin at 3 in the morning without a single tremor in my fingers. A year after my divorce, I was finishing a grueling double shift near the neonatal ward when my ex-mother-in-law cornered me by the east elevators. Beatrice Thorne had a way of smiling that felt like an iron gate latch clicking shut. She marched right up, dripping with Sunday morning satisfaction, and spoke loud enough to make the floor nurses pause. Leaving you was the smartest thing my son ever did. Now he has a beautiful baby boy with your closest friend. 6 years of being whispered about as the broken, empty one, all condensed into a single venomous breath. I didn't flinch. I just looked at her, my pulse as steady as a flat line, and asked, "Is that really what you believe?" 5 minutes later, a man neither she nor my former best friend ever expected to see walked through those double doors. And a name nobody wanted spoken in public was about to be read aloud in a court of law. Welcome back to their secret stories, where quiet women face loud cruelty and the truth takes its time, but it never misses. If a quiet kind of justice is your thing, settle in. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight, and be sure to subscribe. Let me back up those 5 minutes. Because the smile arrived long before the man did, it was a snowy Thursday near the end of a grueling 12-hour shift, and I was handing off a patient's chart to a night nurse named Felix. The neonatal wing sat just down the corridor from the emergency department, where I spent my life, and I'd cut through those quiet, blue, lit hallways 1,000 times without thinking twice. Beatrice was there visiting. Of course she was. Audrey had given birth 3 weeks early, and the entire Thorne clan had been parading through the lobby with silver balloons and blue ribbons. I knew it was happening. I'd braced myself for the rumors. What I hadn't braced for was Beatrice planting herself in my path like she'd been waiting for me all afternoon. She eyed my faded blue scrubs, my tired eyes, and her chin lifted. That was when she delivered her little speech about her son, his new baby, and my best friend. Felix went absolutely rigid beside me. A passing orderly slowed her cart, and I felt my thumb instinctively find the heavy copper key pendant on my neck, the one that had belonged to my mother, pressing it hard against my collarbone, the way I'd done since I was a little girl, waiting out a storm I couldn't stop yet. I didn't raise my voice. I'd learned a long time ago that the loudest person in a room is rarely the one holding the actual keys to the truth. Is that really what you believe? I asked again, my voice even softer this time. Beatrice blinked, clearly thrown by the lack of tears. She'd expected a scene, or at least a crack in my armor. She got nothing. And somewhere down that hall, the automatic doors hissed open, though I didn't turn around to look. I didn't know who was coming, but I knew what I'd already set in motion. Here is the thing you need to understand about me before the rest of this makes sense. I grew up in a rugged ranching town in northern Wyoming, the kind of place where everybody's business is treated like holy scripture. My mother stitched canvas tents at a local outfitter. My father worked as a ranch hand until his hips gave out. I worked 2 jobs to get through university and another 2 to survive medical school, and I learned early to keep my head down and let my labor do the talking. That was my entire philosophy. Do good work in silence, and the truth will eventually sort itself out. People will see who you really are. I believed in that the way some people believe in miracles, it made me excellent in a trauma bay where panic is a luxury you can't afford, and you don't stop to explain your choices. You just repair the damage in front of you and move to the next bed. The smell of that sterile environment, the rubbing alcohol and clean, hot, pressed cotton, used to settle my mind the second I walked through the sliding doors. It meant I was in a space where I was competent, a space where nobody had ever called me hollow. I could manage a cardiac arrest, reset a femur, or talk a terrified teenager through 20 stitches without my heart rate shifting. But that same mechanism, the one that kept me steady in a crisis, had a quiet shadow. I carried my burdens alone. I never asked for help, and when people began telling a story about me, that wasn't true. I made the worst mistake a quiet woman can make. I assumed that staying silent would be enough protection. The hospital was the only sanctuary left where no one dared call me lacking. The rest of my life, by then, had become a completely different story. I married Garrick Thorne when I was 28. He was charming in the way men are when they want everyone to feel chosen. He remembered birthdays. He shook hands with a firm, lingering grip. Most of the county would have sworn by his character, and for the first few years, so would I. We wanted a family. We tried for a long time, and nothing happened. And that quiet absence sat in our house like a heavy piece of furniture no one could move. After 2 years, I did what any physician would do. I suggested we both get evaluated, basic blood tests, a standard workup, the kind of simple screening I ordered for patients every day. Garrick flatly refused. He laughed it off at first, then his tone turned cold and sharp. He told me Thorne men didn't have those kinds of issues. He wrapped his pride in a little speech about faith, about how we should just leave our future in God's hands. I pushed once, I pushed twice, and then I let it go. Because you cannot force a grown man into a clinic, and because I still believed silence was a form of patience. I went and had myself tested alone. My results came back perfectly normal. I remember sitting in my beat-up Jeep in the rain-slicked clinic lot, holding the lab reports, feeling both relieved and deeply unsettled. If it wasn't me, then what was the barrier? I didn't have an answer, and I couldn't force one. And the longer I went without saying anything, the easier it was for the people around me to invent their own narrative. By then, Garrick had already begun dropping hints, quiet, sorrowful comments, to his mother first. That perhaps the issue was mine. That perhaps my body just wasn't up to the task. I had no idea how far a quiet lie can travel when the right person decides to carry it. Beatrice Thorne ran the local civic guild with the precision of a military commander. She'd lost her husband early and raised Garrick on her own, and somewhere in those lean years, she decided her son's perfection was the only proof that her sacrifices had been worth it. He had to be flawless. If he wasn't, then what had all her struggle bought? So, when Garrick whispered that the problem lay with me, Beatrice didn't question it for a single second. She took that lie and she ran with it. It started small, a heavy sigh at a community potluck, a gentle hand on a neighbor's arm, a lowered, sympathetic voice. Poor Garrick. He wants a family so terribly. Then the whispers grew teeth. At a charity dinner that autumn, she introduced me to a visiting deacon's wife with a look of practiced pity. "This is Fiona," she said, "my daughter-in-law. She's a surgeon, you know. Such a quiet tragedy about the children. The woman gave me a soft, knowing nod, and I realized then that whatever story had been spun about me, it had already arrived long before I did. I stood there in my good wool coat, holding a paper plate, while Beatrice patted my hand like I was a patient with a terminal diagnosis. Then she uttered the phrase she would go on to repeat for years, the one she said with the absolute certainty of a prayer. Some hearths just aren't built to hold a fire. She smiled when she said it. She truly believed it. That was the hardest part to swallow. She wasn't being cruel out of malice. She was simply repeating what her son had handed her, and she had no idea the words were a lie wearing her own voice. I drove home that night and said nothing to Garrick. I should have, but I was still waiting for the truth to sort itself out. Audrey Finch had been my closest friend since we were 15. We met in a high school chemistry class and stayed close through every shift in our lives. My years away at university, her long string of retail jobs that never quite worked out, different towns, and a decade of shared secrets. She was the first person I called when my father passed. She stood right beside me at my wedding in a pale green dress and wept during our vows. So when the town gossip started wearing me down, Audrey was the one I leaned on. She'd come over with a bottle of wine, listen to me vent, and always knew exactly how to soothe me, or so I thought. Looking back, every comfort she offered had a hook hidden inside it. You're so successful in your career, Fiona. Maybe motherhood just isn't your path. Garrick adores you. Don't let his mother get under your skin. You don't need a child to be complete. Kind words on the surface, but they always pressed right against the bruise. They always reinforced the idea of my supposed deficiency. I didn't notice how often her gaze drifted to Garrick when we were all in the same room, or how she suddenly knew details about his work schedule that I hadn't mentioned. I was simply too grateful to have one person in my corner who didn't seem to be evaluating my worth. She'd sit on my living room sofa, telling me I deserved better, and I'd nod, never once imagining she believed she deserved my life. People like Audrey don't steal what's yours all at once. They borrow it piece by piece, until one day you look up and the entire structure is gone, and they're standing inside it like they built it themselves. I trusted her completely. That was the second mistake I didn't know I was making. Garrick filed for divorce on a rainy Tuesday morning. I came home from a night shift to find a legal envelope resting on the kitchen island and his side of the closet completely bare. He didn't even have the courage to tell me himself. By Friday, he had moved into Audrey's townhome on the other side of the valley, and the town's narrative was already set in stone. The version circulating was clean simple and incredibly cruel. Fiona was cold. Fiona was married to her career. Fiona couldn't give him a family, and a man deserves a lineage, doesn't he? Beatrice made sure every church pew heard that version. Audrey, my lifelong friend, did absolutely nothing to correct it. The two people who had known me longest let me become a local cautionary tale, and I didn't fight back, because fighting back felt like proving them right. I didn't post a single word online. I didn't call anyone to defend my honor. I just showed up to work the next morning, reset a teenager's dislocated shoulder, told him he'd play soccer again, and he did. And that felt like the only real, clean thing in my entire world. If you've ever swallowed a massive lie about yourself just to keep the peace, to protect a family, a friendship, or a reputation you spent half your life building, then you know exactly how that tastes. It tastes like dust you aren't allowed to spit out. But stay with me, because this was the moment I began to realize something vital. The peace I was guarding so carefully wasn't actually mine. It belonged entirely to the people who were lying about me. They were the ones who desperately needed me to stay quiet. Comment truth if you've ever found yourself in that position. And keep watching, because my silence was about to end. I want to tell you about the day a hospital board meeting taught me that some things are worth raising your voice for. The gossip stopped being just a personal sorrow the day it walked into my professional life. I'd been next in line for years to take over as chief of emergency medicine. I'd authored the trauma protocols that half the county clinics now relied on. The position was mine by right of service, and everyone in the building knew it. Then the whispers reached the credentialing committee, not the facts. There were no facts to find, just the vague, ugly shape of them. Dr. Croft's personal life is unstable. There are serious questions about her emotional resilience. Did you hear about the divorce? About what the Thorne family says? One board member, an administrator who played golf with Garrick's uncle, began asking pointed questions about my ability to perform under high stress. As if I hadn't spent a decade keeping people alive while they bled out on my table. When the promotion was finally announced, the job went to a junior surgeon with half my clinical hours and none of my protocol credentials. They told me I was an invaluable asset. They told me it was an incredibly close decision. They didn't state the real reason, but I'd grown up in a small town. I knew what a professional execution sounded like when it was wrapped in polite compliments. That was the night the switch flipped inside me. A lie about my own body had cost me my marriage, and I'd let it go because I thought enduring it was the noble choice. But now, that same lie was reaching into the one sanctuary I had left, my work, my name, the legacy I'd bled for. I sat in my Jeep in the dark hospital lot, the exact same way I had years earlier with my normal lab results, and I realized that the silence I'd been so proud of had a massive price tag, and some other party had been quietly running up my tab. A senior nurse I trusted gave me the contact details of a litigator named Miriam Stone. Miriam's office was situated above an old leather workshop, and she had reading glasses perched in her silver hair and a gaze that told you she was already 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. I told her everything. The BARREN marriage, the town gossip, the hospital board, the promotion I'd lost. She listened without a single interruption, which is rare for a lawyer. And when I finally finished, she capped her fountain pen. "What you're describing is a textbook case of defamation," she said. "Perhaps false light, but I won't sugarcoat it. It's a steep climb." She laid out the battle plan. To win, we had to establish 3 distinct things: that a specific, false statement of fact had been made, that it had been actively disseminated to third parties, and that it had caused me direct, quantifiable professional damage. "The damages are easy," Miriam said. "A lost directorship has a clear financial value. A salary difference is a hard number. That's the simple part." I sat there, slowly spinning the copper key pendant around my neck. "And the falsity?" Miriam looked at me over the rims of her glasses. That is the part you have to be willing to fight for in a public record. They will claim the statement is true. They will argue you really were the reason for the childless marriage. To win, you must be prepared to prove in court that it wasn't you. I felt my chest tighten, because how could I possibly prove that? My test results were normal, but a normal test doesn't explain why the marriage stayed empty. It only proved my own health. I almost stood up and walked out. The entire prospect felt like inviting the public to dissect my most intimate grief. Then Miriam said the words I needed to hear. Silence isn't a virtue, Fiona, when it's costing you your life's work. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is force them to prove the lies they tell. I didn't answer her immediately, but I didn't leave either. I spent 2 weeks weighing the cost. I'm not a reckless person. I make decisions the way I analyze a trauma scan, methodically, then decisively. I wrote down everything I stood to lose. The community I'd lived in my entire life. My standing in a town that already believed the worst. The way people would talk, labeling me bitter, calling me vengeful, saying I was a scorned ex-wife suing a family out of spite. I knew exactly how that script would play out because they'd already written the first act. But then I wrote down the other side of the ledger, my name, my career, the truth, and the simple, undeniable fact that I had done nothing wrong and was being punished for it anyway. I kept returning to one realization. I wasn't doing this to destroy Garrick. If I'd wanted to hurt him, I'd had a year of opportunities. I was doing this so a hospital credentialing board would stop believing a fabricated story so that the next time my name was spoken in a closed room, it was clean. That was the boundary I drew. This wouldn't be about revenge. Revenge is loud, chaotic, and never satisfied. This would be the truth, spoken once in a place where it actually mattered, by a woman who was finally done carrying a burden that belonged to someone else. I called Miriam on a Monday morning before my shift. I told her I was ready. Excellent, she said. Then let's make them repeat those lies under oath. I hung up, walked into the trauma bay, and had the steadiest shift I'd experienced in over a year. It turns out a resolved mind is its own kind of anesthesia. Miriam drafted the civil complaint over the following weeks. It detailed the specific statements, the exact dates, and the names of the witnesses who had heard them. It laid out the lost promotion, the salary differential, and the documented damage to my professional standing. Reading the draft was a surreal experience. My entire private humiliation had been organized, numbered, and turned into a document with legal weight. When the lawsuit was officially filed, the news swept through our valley faster than a wildfire. Fiona Croft is suing the Thorns. Beatrice was absolutely furious. She told her civic guild that I had become bitter and unhinged, that the grief of my empty house had poisoned my mind. She doubled down on every claim she'd ever made, which, though she didn't realize it, was precisely what Miriam had anticipated. Garrick stayed completely silent at first. Audrey did too, but my phone began to buzz. Some messages were hostile, some were purely gossip-seeking, but a few were quietly supportive notes from women who had experienced their own reputations rewritten by families they had once loved. One text read simply, "Good for you." They did the same thing to my cousin. I didn't reply to any of them. I just kept showing up for my shifts and let the litigation move at the glacial pace of the justice system. Miriam told me the next phase was the defense's response. How Garrick's legal team chose to answer the complaint would dictate our entire strategy. They have two choices, she explained. They can claim the statements were merely expressions of opinion, hurt feelings, nothing actionable under the law. That route is frustrating, but it's safe for them. She tapped her pen against her desk. Or they can plant their flag and claim truth as their absolute defense, arguing that the statements were accurate, that you really were the medical reason for the childless marriage. That is the road I'm praying they take. I asked her why. She smiled like a strategist who had already mapped out the entire board. Because if they claim truth, they have to prove it. And to prove it, they have to open a door. They chose the second road. Of course they did. Garrick's attorney filed an answer that claimed the statements regarding my infertility weren't defamatory because they were factual. The failure of the marriage to produce offspring, they argued in writing, was a medical reality, and the medical issue was mine. When Miriam called to deliver the news, I could hear a quiet satisfaction in her voice. They just walked right into it, she told me. Truth is an absolute defense, but here is what they didn't think through. She let the moment hang. To prove you were the one who was infertile, they have to put the medical history of both spouses in front of the court. Now, reproductive records are highly protected, and no judge will compel them without cause. We still have to convince the court of their relevance, but because they asserted under oath that the cause was definitely you, they cannot make that claim and then shield him from scrutiny. That is our opening. It's a crack in the wall, and I can work with a crack. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. Which means, Miriam said. They just put Garrick's own medical history directly in play. He spent years hiding his secrets behind his mother's gossip. By swearing to this in a legal pleading, his attorney may have given us the exact standing we need to demand his records. No guarantees, but it's the best leverage we could have hoped for. For 6 years, my body had been a topic of casual discussion at potlucks and committee meetings. And in trying to make that narrative official to win a lawsuit, the Thorns had done the one thing none of them had ever been willing to do. They had opened the door to examining Garrick. I thought about his absolute refusal to seek testing all those years ago, his cold anger, the way the entire subject was locked away whenever it pointed in his direction. I didn't say anything to Miriam just yet, but a memory I had buried deep inside began to stir, and I felt the first real chill of suspicion. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I did what I always do when a clinical case doesn't make sense. I went back through the chronology in my mind, slow and meticulous, looking for the detail I had missed the first time. And there it was 7 years back, a morning early in our marriage, when Garrick had driven down to Denver alone for what he claimed was a routine physical. He'd been gone the entire day. He came home completely different, quiet in a way that wasn't like him, snapping at me over minor things, and he poured himself a glass of whiskey before dinner, which he never did during the week. I'd asked him if the doctor had found anything concerning. He told me the physician was an idiot. The trip had been a complete waste of time, and he changed the subject so aggressively it felt like a warning. And here was the detail that kept me staring at the dark ceiling. After that day, he never mentioned fertility testing again. not once. Before that Denver trip, he'd at least pretended to consider it. Afterward, the door was slammed shut, and within that very same month, the first whispers about my issues began to circulate. I'd filed it away back then as a husband being sensitive about his masculinity. I hadn't connected it to any deeper deception because I hadn't been looking for a lie. You don't audit the character of the person you love. But now, with Miriam's words echoing in my mind, that quiet day in Denver looked less like a wasted trip and more like the moment a massive deception was born. I didn't have hard proof. I want to be clear about that. I had a memory and a deep intuition, which is worth nothing in a court of law. But it was more than enough to show Miriam where we needed to dig. And the next morning, that's exactly what I did. Miriam listened to the story of the Denver trip without taking a single note, which I had come to realize meant she was processing the information deeply. When I finished, she sat in silence for a moment. On its own, it's just an anecdote, she said, a memory of a bad mood. But it gives us a highly specific target. She explained the next legal steps. Because the defense had made my reproductive health the central issue, and because they asserted the cause was entirely mine, Miriam could petition the court to compel the production of Garrick's relevant medical records. If he wants to claim in public that the fault was yours, she said, the law allows us to see if he was actually the one with the diagnosis. That is how discovery works. You don't get to open the door only halfway. She filed the motion the following week. Garrick's attorney fought it with everything they had, and I knew then that we had touched a nerve. Because legal teams don't expend that much energy defending a blank slate. They argued patient privacy. They argued lack of relevance. They used every procedural delay they could think of to keep that file sealed. The motion hearing was scheduled, and I had to live with the agonizing weight. I am a surgeon. I am used to ordering an imaging study and getting a definitive answer. This was entirely different. This was begging a judge for permission to even look for the answer. I went back to my hospital shifts, resetting limbs, reading scans, and trying desperately not to obsess over a folder sitting in a Denver clinic archive that might contain everything or absolutely nothing. Miriam urged me to have faith. The legal process moves slowly for a reason, she said. It gives the truth time to lose its terrors. I wasn't afraid of the truth. I'd never been afraid of the truth. I was only terrified they would find a way to keep it buried. Before the judge would rule on our motion, Miriam required me to execute a verified complaint, a sworn statement of every allegation, every date, and every witness, signed under penalty of perjury. She placed the thick document on the desk between us, marked with bright adhesive tabs wherever my signature was required. Read every single word, she instructed. Sign only what you know to be absolute fact. So I read it page by page, the potluck whispers, the deacon's wife, the exact words Beatrice had uttered at the charity dinner about how some hearths just aren't built to hold a fire. The hospital board meeting, the directorship I'd lost, the lost income. Seeing my years of quiet suffering organized into numbered, clinical paragraphs did something to me. It made the lie look incredibly fragile. I picked up the pen Miriam offered, and I noticed the scent of the office. Not the clean, cold bleach of my hospital ward, but the comforting smell of paper, ink, and the old leather from the workshop downstairs. For years, that hospital smell had represented safety, my hiding place. Now, here I was, in a different kind of room, one I'd had to step into the open to find, and I was no longer hiding. I pressed the pen to the paper. My mother's copper pendant hung heavy against my chest as I signed, and I thought of her old saying, "That patience isn't just waiting around, it's recognizing the exact moment to act." This was that moment. My signature went down clean and steady. When I lifted the pen, the weight shifted. The complaint was verified. The motion was active. Whatever was contained in that clinic folder in Denver, the machinery of the law was now actively searching for it. And I was the one who had pulled the lever. Miriam gathered the documents and tapped them flat on her desk. "No. We wait for the court's order," she said. I nodded. For the first time, the wait didn't feel like helplessness. It felt like a slow burning fuse. The ruling arrived on a gray afternoon in the middle of a quiet shift. Miriam called, and I stepped into a supply room to take it. Surrounded by boxes of sterile gloves and saline bags, my chest tightening in a way it never did during a medical emergency. "The judge granted the motion," she said, her voice steady. "With narrow limits, but she granted it." She explained the terms carefully. Because the defense had made my fertility the cornerstone of their case, the court ruled that Garrick's historical reproductive records had become presumptively discoverable. They wouldn't be made public immediately. They would be produced under a strict protective order, reviewed first by counsel and the court, and used only as the litigation required. It's not an automatic victory. Miriam cautioned, ever the professional. We still don't know what's in that file. There could be nothing. But they can no longer keep the vault locked. I stood in that supply room and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 7 long years. Across town, I would later learn, the news was received with absolute panic. Garrick's attorney immediately requested an emergency conference. Beatrice called Miriam's office twice, only to be politely informed that counsel could not speak with her directly. And for the very first time, the people who had spent years defining the truth of my body went completely pale at the thought of a court defining the truth of Garrick's. I didn't celebrate. I want you to understand that. I didn't send a single text, and I didn't smile at my reflection in the mirror. I finished my shift, completed my charting, and drove home to my quiet apartment. But that night, I slept deeply for the first time in months, because I knew the files were coming, and I knew that records, unlike people, do not know how to tell a lie. The first indication that their defense was crumbling didn't come from Garrick or his mother. It came from Audrey. She sent me a text message out of nowhere, after a year of absolute silence. "Please don't do this, Fiona. Think about the baby." I read those 10 words 3 times. We hadn't spoken since the day the divorce papers were filed. She had taken my husband, moved into my life, and never once attempted to explain or apologize. And now, suddenly, she was pleading with me to halt a lawsuit that, on its face, had absolutely nothing to do with her. That was the detail that snagged in my mind. The lawsuit was between me, Garrick, and Beatrice. It was about statements made about my body, about a promotion I had lost. Why would Audrey, who had seemingly won everything, be terrified of it? Why would a woman holding the child, the husband, and the home be texting her former best friend at midnight, begging her to stop digging, People who beg you to stop digging usually know exactly what is buried in the yard. I had learned that lesson the hard way. I didn't reply to her. I just sat in the dark with the question, feeling the shape of a massive secret I couldn't see yet. Here is what I had realized by then, and what I want you to hear if you have ever been the quiet one in the middle of a storm. The people who are most terrified of the truth are rarely the ones it's supposed to protect. I wasn't angry with Audrey. I was deeply, profoundly curious. If a quiet woman reclaiming her power is your kind of story, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. And tell me in the comments, at what point would you have walked away? Because I almost did twice. But Audrey's text didn't make me want to stop. It made me want to push harder. A terrified person had just revealed, without intending to, that there was something far bigger hidden in the dark. The medical files arrived 8 days later. I want to be precise about the protocol because it matters. I did not see them first. I couldn't and I wouldn't. I am a physician, and there are ethical boundaries regarding records I have no legal right to view. Not my ex-husband's, not anyone's. That is the law, and it is a necessary one. The records were delivered directly to Miriam under the court's protective order. She reviewed them with the defense counsel present according to the judge's instructions. Then she called me and asked me to come to her office immediately. I knew the moment I walked in. She had that grave, careful expression people wear when they are about to deliver life-altering news. 7 years ago, Miriam said, Garrick went to that clinic in Denver. Just as you remembered. She slid a single photocopied sheet across the desk toward me. Only the relevant clinical line was visible, the rest redacted under the court's seal. The diagnosis was a term I had written on patient charts myself, azoospermia. No viable sperm. Garrick had been informed in plain, undeniable medical terms that he was biologically incapable of fathering a child. 7 years ago, the exact same week he had come home silent, angry, and closed the door on the subject forever. The exact same stretch of weeks when the whispers about my barrenness began to spread. I sat completely still. Miriam watched me the way I watch a family after delivering a terminal diagnosis. I didn't weep and I didn't scream. I just felt a massive, silent alignment happen inside me, like a dislocated joint finally slipping back into its proper place. For 6 years, I had been labeled the broken one, the tragedy of the Thorne family, and the man who had allowed an entire community to believe that had known the entire time that the empty cradle was his doing. I drove home with that single page folded in my purse, and I didn't turn on the car radio. I expected to feel a sense of triumph. I'd braced myself for it, even feared it, because I didn't want to become a person who found joy in another's exposure. But triumph never arrived. What came instead was a profound, heavy grief. 6 years of my life had been spent absorbing a shame that was never mine to bear. Every pitying look at the grocery store, some hearths just aren't built to hold a fire. Every night I'd lain awake wondering what was wrong with my body, why I had failed our marriage. All of it had been a fiction Garrick constructed to shield himself from a truth he was too proud to face. He had handed his inadequacy to me and let me wear it in public for years, and his mother had pinned it to my chest with both hands. I sat in my Jeep in the parking lot of my apartment building, and I said the words out loud to the empty seat beside me. The same question I had asked Beatrice in the hospital corridor. Is that really what you believe? Only now did I understand the full weight of the question. I had asked it of a woman who was so entirely certain I was flawed, and the real answer had been sitting in a locked cabinet in Denver the entire time. I wasn't broken. I never had been. The relief didn't feel like a sudden burst of light. It felt like a long, deep exhalation, like the first full breath after years of shallow ones. But beneath that relief, a new question was already forming, and it was impossible to ignore. If Garrick was biologically incapable of fathering a child 7 years ago, if the diagnosis was absolute, then the baby boy Beatrice had bragged about, the child Garrick was parading through the hospital ward, the son he had allegedly left me to conceive with my best friend, could not possibly be his. The biology was simple and brutal. A man with that diagnosis does not father a child naturally. It is vanishingly rare without specialized treatments that Garrick had never pursued, which left a contradiction far too massive to ignore. Either the Denver clinic had made a catastrophic error, which is highly unlikely, or the child everyone believed was fathered by another man. I wasn't going to speculate, but I knew it was a question that required a factual resolution, not more rumors. And suddenly, Audrey's frantic midnight text made a terrible, perfect kind of sense. Please don't do this. Think about the baby. She wasn't trying to protect Garrick's feelings. She was terrified of what a court-ordered review of medical records would drag into the light of day, because Audrey knew the truth. She knew exactly whose child she was carrying. I want to be very clear about my actions here. I did not go looking for the baby's medical records. I had no right to them, and I wouldn't have looked if I did. The child was entirely innocent, and I have never wished him anything but a peaceful life. What I possessed was a logical contradiction created entirely by the Thorns' own legal defense. They had sworn under oath that the infertility was mine. The records proved it was Garrick's, and a healthy infant across town proved someone was lying about something far vaster than a broken marriage. I called Miriam. There is more to this story, I told her. She didn't hesitate. Then we let the legal process reveal it, not us. The man who had walked into the neonatal ward that afternoon, the one I mentioned at the very beginning, had a name. Callum Hayes. I didn't know him then. I learned about him the way I learned everything in this case, methodically, through the proper legal channels. It turned out that during the months Audrey and Garrick were beginning their affair, while Garrick was still telling the town his wife was defective, Audrey had also been seeing someone else. Callum, a quiet, hard-working man who had been led to believe their relationship was heading towards something permanent. When Audrey ultimately chose Garrick and his family's local prominence, she had cut Callum off completely. She blocked his calls, never informed him she was pregnant, and never mentioned a word about the birth. She had gambled that he would simply go away, that he would never connect the dates. But the timeline hadn't sat right with Callum, and he had spent months asking quiet questions of mutual acquaintances. That very morning, someone had let slip the hospital name and the delivery date. So he came to see the infant he suspected was his own flesh and blood. And the moment he stepped through those double doors, the one person Audrey was certain would never find her, Audrey's face drained of every ounce of color. That is the image I want you to hold. Beatrice, standing smugly by the elevators, convinced her son's new life had proven my worthlessness, and 5 steps behind her, walking into the room, the living proof that their entire family legacy was built on a foundation of lies they had constructed. I didn't orchestrate that moment. I didn't even fully comprehend it when it occurred. I had simply smiled at Beatrice and asked if that was really what she believed. And then a door opened, and a stranger walked through, and their entire house of cards began to quietly collapse without me lifting a single finger. Callum, it turned out, had questions that only a court could resolve, and in a town that was so certain they knew the truth about my body, the truth about theirs was about to be laid bare. Garrick knew. That is the realization I keep coming back to, the detail that elevates this from a tragedy to something unforgivable. He had known for 7 years that he could not father a child. So when Audrey became pregnant, he knew with absolute certainty that the baby was not his, and he claimed it anyway. He stood before his mother, his community, and his church, and let them all believe he had fathered a son, the son his, BARREN, first wife had failed to provide. He used an innocent child to complete the narrative that had ruined my reputation. Think about the sheer audacity of that. The cruelty isn't just the betrayal or the lies about my body, though those are egregious. It is the fact that he looked at a child he knew wasn't his and saw, first and foremost, a political tool, a validation of his manhood, the final punctuation mark on the sentence he had been writing about me for years. I tried sincerely to find some shred of empathy for him. I am not a vindictive person by nature, but every time I reached for it, I hit the exact same wall. He'd had 100 opportunities to speak the truth and let me go with my dignity intact. Instead, he built a public monument to a lie and placed an innocent child at the center of it. When Miriam informed me that Garrick's attorney had gone completely silent, no more motions, no more disputes, just a formal request to discuss a settlement, I understood why. Garrick was no longer afraid of losing a defamation suit. He was terrified of what a trial would reveal in open court about the child he had been parading around town. He had spent 7 years controlling the narrative, and for the first time, the story was about to escape his grasp entirely. Beatrice came to see me before the final hearing. She appeared at my apartment door on a Sunday afternoon, dressed in her church clothes, and I almost left the deadbolt turned. When I opened it, she looked much older than I remembered. Frailer. She didn't apologize. I want to be entirely honest about that, because for a split second, I thought she might. She stood on my welcome mat and asked me, her voice trembling, to withdraw the lawsuit. Not for Garrick, she pleaded, but for the family name, for the baby, for our standing. And as she spoke, I saw something I hadn't expected to see. I saw a mother who had been systematically lied to by her own son for 7 years. A widow who had invested everything she had into her only boy, building her entire identity around the belief that he was honorable. She hadn't spread those vicious rumors because she was inherently evil. She had spread them because Garrick had handed them to her, polished and convincing, and she loved him too much to ever doubt his word. For one heartbeat, standing in my doorway, I felt a deep pity for her. She was human, and she had been used as a shield. But then she uttered the phrase again, the line she had carried like a shield of her own. Except this time, It was a plea instead of a judgment. Some hearths just aren't built to hold a fire, Fiona. Why drag us all through the mud over it? And I understood that even now, standing on the precipice of exposure, she would still rather protect the lie than accept the truth. Empathy is not the same thing as capitulation. I could recognize her grief and still refuse to carry her son's disgrace for another single day. "Beatrice," I said softly, "go home." The mud was never mine to begin with. She turned and left without another word, and I closed the door. I didn't feel vindictive. I just felt completely finished. Garrick's legal team offered a substantial settlement, a private one. They would pay a significant financial sum and issue a confidential retraction to the hospital credentialing board, restoring my professional record on the condition that I agreed to seal the entire file and never speak of the matter again. Miriam laid the proposal on her desk and watched me closely. "It's a highly favorable agreement on paper," she said. "You get your professional standing back. The board is corrected. You can walk away with everything you initially sought." She wasn't wrong. It was, by any objective metric, a total victory. My reputation would be restored. The directorship would be back within reach. And all I had to do was allow the truth to be whispered in a closed room and locked in a drawer forever. While Beatrice continued her whispers at church, Garrick continued playing the proud father of a child that wasn't his, and the rumors of the defective doctor lingered in the corners of the town where confidential retractions would never reach. I sat with it for a long time, then I looked at Miriam and said no, not out of anger. I want to be clear about the distinction, because it matters. I didn't refuse the settlement because I wanted to watch Garrick suffer. I refused because a private truth is just a quieter version of the same old lie. For 6 years, they had spoken their untruths about me out loud in public spaces where everyone could hear. The correction had to exist in the exact same arena, not a whisper, not a sealed settlement. The truth had to be spoken once, in the light where it counted. I am not going to accept a quiet apology for a wound they inflicted in public. I told Miriam, "We say it once where it matters, and then I am done." Miriam smiled, capping her pen. "Then we go to court," she said. "We're something you can breathe in." The hearing was convened at the county courthouse on a bright, freezing morning. I expected my nerves to get the better of me. I had run countless trauma codes without a tremor, but this was different, because this time my own life was the patient on the table. The courtroom filled in a way that perfectly illustrated how small towns operate. 2 administrators from the hospital board were there, eager to see where they had erred. Several members of Beatrice's civic guild sat in the middle rows, the same women who had nodded along to her pitying comments for years. Beatrice herself sat rigid in the second row. Garrick was beside his counsel, pale and sweating in a wool suit that looked too loose for him, and Audrey sat near the back, entirely motionless, with Callum sitting 2 rows behind her, his presence a silent weight she could feel without even turning her head. I sat at our table and looked at the gathering. For 6 years, these people had been the audience to my silent disgrace. They had watched a woman get branded as lacking and said nothing. Now they were about to witness the correction. That was the condition I had insisted upon, the one Miriam understood completely. The lie had been public, therefore. The truth had to be public. It had to be witnessed by the same eyes, or the damage would never truly be undone. I wasn't there to make a scene. I had resolved that weeks ago. I was there to let the facts stand in the light, on the record, in the one room where lying carries a real cost. The judge took the bench, the room fell into a heavy silence, and I felt my mother's copper key pendant, cool and solid against my skin, marking the moment I had waited 6 years to reach. Miriam didn't raise her voice once. That is what remains most vivid in my memory. She built our case the way a physician builds a diagnosis, one clinical finding at a time, methodical and undeniable, until only one conclusion was left standing. She established the defamatory statements, the dates, the witnesses. Beatrice's own words, repeated at community dinners, that some hearths just aren't built to hold a fire. She established the direct professional harm, the directorship denied, the lost income, the damage to my medical standing. Then she addressed the defense's claim of truth, the assertion that the infertility was mine, and she presented the medical records the defense themselves had forced into the proceedings by making that claim. Under the court's protective order, only the single critical line was read aloud. 7 years ago, Garrick Thorne had been diagnosed at a Denver clinic with a condition that made biological fatherhood medically impossible. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted instantly. I watched the Civic Guild women slowly turn their heads to look at Beatrice, who had gone entirely white, then Miriam, with absolute calm, laid the central contradiction on the table, the one the Thornes had constructed with their own hands. The defense had sworn under oath that our childless marriage was my failure. The records proved it was Garrick's, and yet there was a baby. She noted that the question of the child's paternity had become a matter of record in a separate family court proceeding, and that genetic testing had confirmed Garrick was not the biological father. She stated it plainly, without theatricality, like reading a lab report. And that was when Garrick stood up. You can't. His voice cracked, echoing off the high wood paneling. The judge immediately ordered him to sit. Beatrice was on her feet as well, shouting my name like an indictment, claiming I had twisted the facts, that none of it was true. The two of them, loud and completely unraveling, while I sat perfectly still at my table and uttered not a single word. Beatrice turned on me then, with the desperate fury of someone realizing the water is rising. Her composure was entirely gone. Her civic pride was shattered, and from the ruins came the only words she had left. "Some hearths just aren't built to hold a fire!" she cried, pointing a trembling hand across the aisle. "Some hearths just aren't." She couldn't even finish the sentence the second time, and I stood up slowly because I had waited 6 years and I was going to take my time. I didn't raise my voice. I kept my tone flat, clear, and clinical, the voice I use when I have to tell a family a hard, undeniable truth. "You're right, Beatrice," I said. The entire courtroom went dead silent. "You're absolutely right. One person in that marriage was never built to have children." I let those words sit in the quiet room. I looked directly at Garrick, then back at his mother. The medical file had only ever contained his name. Beatrice's hand dropped slowly to her side. Garrick buried his face in his hands, and the women from the Civic Guild, the ones who had whispered about me for years, sat there as the truth finally settled over them, rewriting every single rumor they had ever believed. I wasn't broken. I never had been. The man who had let an entire community believe otherwise was sitting 6 feet away, completely undone, while the quiet woman he had labeled empty stood steady on her own 2 feet. I had spoken the truth once in public, where it mattered, and I was finally ready to lay the burden down. What followed wasn't a scene of dramatic shouting. It was much quieter than that, and for the Thorns, far more devastating. Garrick didn't offer another defense. He sat with his head bowed while his attorney requested a brief recess, and when the judge granted it, he didn't move. He just stayed in his seat, a man watching 6 years of careful deception evaporate in a single morning. The townspeople gathered their things and filed out with their eyes fixed on the floor. I knew that by nightfall, the real story would be circulating through the valley just as fast as the lie ever had. Beatrice followed them out, looking smaller than I had ever seen her, no longer the leader of any committee. And Audrey had slipped out during the recess, but not before Callum rose from his seat and walked out the same doors, closed behind her. The question of that child's future was finally heading toward an honest resolution. I sat at the table as the courtroom emptied. Miriam placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You did that without ever raising your voice?" she said. "I've been practicing law for 30 years. You'd be amazed how rare that is." The tangible resolutions arrived in the weeks that followed. Garrick's standing in the valley, the reputation he had protected at the expense of my life, simply vanished. You cannot outrun a public court record in a place that small. He sold his share of his business within months and moved 2 states away to a place where nobody knew his history. He had spent 6 years ensuring everyone believed a falsehood about me. In the end, the truth didn't require me to pursue him. It just needed to be spoken once, in the correct room. The hospital board didn't make a public spectacle of their correction, which was entirely fine by me. A few weeks after the hearing, the board president requested a meeting. He was one of the administrators who had sat in that courtroom, and he had the deeply uncomfortable look of a man who realized he had aligned himself with a lie. He informed me the chief of emergency medicine position was being reopened. He told me they had reviewed the credentialing files and found the previous concerns regarding my emotional stability to be entirely without merit. He didn't offer a formal apology, but he came close. And from a corporate hospital board, close is about all you can expect. I accepted the directorship, not because I needed another victory, but because the position was mine, earned through my own labor and my own years of service, and I was no longer going to let a falsehood keep me from it. My first week in the new role, I walked into the trauma bay and breathed in that familiar scent of sterile linens and antiseptic. The smell that used to represent a hiding place because it was the only space where no one called me hollow. It smelled different now. It smelled like a space I had reclaimed. I managed my first major trauma as director with my hands as steady as they had ever been afterward. As I stood at the sink washing up, I caught my reflection in the dark glass of the window. The deep exhaustion that had lived in my face for years was gone. I want to tell you, I felt vindicated, and I did. But more than that, I felt incredibly light, like I had been carrying a heavy sack of gravel for 6 years without realizing there was a strap, and someone had finally told me I was allowed to drop it on the ground. People always want to know what happened to everyone afterward. So let me tell you, and then I will let you go. Garrick left, as I said. Last I heard, he was living somewhere in the Midwest, attempting to rebuild his life, where his name carried no weight. I don't wish him ill, indeed. I don't wish him much of anything anymore, which is its own profound kind of peace. Beatrice lost the social capital she had spent her entire life building, not because I actively sought to destroy her. I never spoke a single word against her to her church community, but because the truth about her son was simply too large to hide in a town of that size. The civic groups she had run for 3 decades quietly restructured without her. I heard she stopped attending community events entirely. I felt a genuine sadness about that. The sadness you feel for someone who chose to cling to a lie until the lie took everything she had left. Audrey and Calamum resolved the custody and paternity matters through the family court system the proper way. And I hope, for the sake of that innocent little boy, they found some measure of stability on the other side of it. That child never asked to be part of a deception. Audrey and I never spoke again. Some bonds don't just break. They simply turn out to have never been what you believe them to be. You lay them down with the rest of the weight, and you walk away. As for me, I kept the directorship, kept my apartment, and kept the copper key pendant on my neck. I didn't file any further claims. I had obtained exactly what I came for. My name was clean, and the truth was standing on its own. And that was more than enough. There was one final thing I did, and then I was completely finished. I wrote Beatrice a brief note, not a long one, and certainly not an angry one. I'd thought about her standing on my welcome mat in her Sunday best, a mother who had been deceived by her own child and chose to believe the deception anyway. I realized I didn't want to carry any anger toward her into my future. Anger is just another sack of gravel. So I kept it simple. I won't carry your son's lie anymore, I wrote. You shouldn't either. That was all. I didn't expect a response, and I never received one, but sending it closed the door completely. I slipped my mother's copper key pendant off my neck that night and held it in my palm, thinking about her old wisdoms. That patience isn't just waiting. It's knowing the exact moment when the time is right. I had waited 6 years for that moment. It had arrived, and I had met it. And now, the years ahead of me weren't borrowed against some future reckoning. They were simply mine. The quiet, clean rest of my life. If you take one lesson from my journey, let it be this: the truth doesn't need to shout, and it doesn't need to chase anyone down. It simply waits, patient as a stone, for the day someone finally stops being afraid and asks the right question out loud. That is my story. 6 years of carrying a shame that was never mine, and one quiet question that brought the entire structure down. If you have ever been told you were the broken one, let this be your sign to stop carrying that weight. Tell your truth where it matters, and then lay it down. If this story spoke to you tonight, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below. Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in their secret stories.